Let's dive right into today's explainer, where we're going to unpack a fascinating paradox at the very heart of India's corporate funding and disaster resilience. We hear a lot about sustainable development these days, right? But today we're looking at the hard numbers behind how it's actually funded, and we're going to discover a critical missing piece that affects literally millions of lives.
Let's kick off our investigation with a massive hypothetical. If you were handed billions of dollars to shield an entire country from severe climate and disaster risks, where would you put it? What would your strategy be? Would you wait for a storm to hit and then send aid? Or would you build stronger foundations before the clouds even gather? Keep that choice in the back of your mind, because it's the exact dilemma playing out on a massive scale in India right now.
You see, India uniquely mandates that qualifying companies spend 2% of their net profits on corporate social responsibility, or CSR. We're talking about a monumental shift here, from voluntary charity to a strict statutory obligation. This generates a massive amount of potential capital for nation building. By law, this wealth is supposed to help drive sustainable development and disaster resilience. But, as we'll see, just having the money is really only half the battle.
So here is our investigation for today. We'll look at India's CSR funding paradox, map out the resilience gap, dive into the psychology of giving, compare reactive and proactive strategies, and finally, look at steering towards sustainable development.
Let's jump right into Part 1, India's CSR funding paradox.
Despite a nationwide mandate aimed at equitable development, over 80% of CSR funds are funneled directly into highly industrialized, wealthy states. We're talking about hubs like Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Karnataka. That leaves the vast majority of the country, including some of its absolute most vulnerable regions, to divide up a meager 20% of the pie. It's a staggering concentration of wealth, and it completely bypasses the areas that arguably need it the absolute most.
Which brings us to Part 2, mapping the resilience gap.
And this is our smoking gun. There is a massive, glaring mismatch between states with the highest disaster risk indices and the states actually receiving CSR funding. When you compare the disaster risk of a state with the CSR investment they receive, the peaks of the risk actually hover over states with barely any funding at all. Places like Assam or Bihar have immense vulnerability, yet the funding spikes happen in Maharashtra, where the relative disaster risk is much, much lower. This exact mismatch is the CSR resilience gap in a nutshell.
But this gap isn't just geographic, it's sectoral too. The money heavily clusters in highly measurable sectors. Think education, healthcare, and rural development. Now, schools and hospitals are obviously vital, no doubt about it, but because they're so easy to count and photograph, they totally dominate the funding. Meanwhile, the critical, long-term disaster mitigation projects, the kind of invisible work that actually prevents crises, they're left completely in the dust.
So why does this happen? Let's look at Part 3, the psychology of giving. Corporate decision makers aren't acting maliciously here. They're actually operating within a complex web of behavioral biases. The first psychological driver is something called institutional isomorphism. Basically, organizations tend to adopt similar structures and practices, often mimicking their successful peers. Why? To achieve social and regulatory legitimacy. So rather than making strategic, localized choices, companies face immense pressure to simply copy what everyone else is doing. It prioritizes checking boxes over maximizing real-world impact.
Then we have proximity bias. Think of this as the corporate equivalent of only ever donating to your local neighborhood bake sale. It's the preference to invest geographically close to headquarters to reduce implementation risk and foster local goodwill. Since 61% of the total CSR spend comes from corporate headquarters located in just Maharashtra and Delhi, well, the money naturally stays right in their backyards. It's easier to manage, and it buys local goodwill for the company's immediate employees.
Finally, there's signaling bias. Companies suffer from what researchers call a measurability constraint. They heavily favor investing in projects that offer easily measurable, rapid, and highly visible outcomes. They want a new school building that they can photograph and put on the cover of an annual report to clearly signal their moral character to stakeholders. Funding the invisible, highly complex work of long-term climate proofing, well, that doesn't make for a great photo op, even if it might literally save thousands of lives over the next decade.
Moving on to Part 4, reactive versus proactive investing.
In the world of disaster management, we basically have two types of funding. Currently, corporate funds are heavily skewed toward ex post, reactive relief. That's disaster response, relief, and recovery, mopping up after the storm. It's essential, sure, but it's like buying buckets after it starts raining inside your house. What the system desperately needs is ex ante, proactive risk reduction. Prevention and mitigation, fixing the roof before it rains. Right now, because of those biases we just talked about, almost no corporate money goes toward fixing the roof.
You can see this reactive nature perfectly illustrated in the data from the devastating 2018 Kerala floods. The intense media visibility and public pressure triggered an absolutely massive influx of response funds from corporations. It proves that when the pressure is high enough, companies absolutely can and will mobilize incredible resources, totally overriding their usual proximity biases. But it's entirely temporary and completely reactive. Once the cameras leave, the funding dries up, and the long-term systemic vulnerabilities remain completely untouched.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Steering Towards Sustainable Development.
To truly protect the nation, we have to shift this massive financial engine from mere compliance-driven spending to strategic, risk-data-driven investing. The roadmap for this involves a few specific policy tweaks. First, reframing the legal language in Schedule 7 of the Companies Act to legally separate reactive relief from proactive risk reduction. Second, internally, companies need to implement tiered investment strategies. And third, and this is really the most exciting recommendation, launching a powerful new public-private partnership model called the Risk-Weighted Expenditure Support Program, or RWESP.
Here's how the RWS would completely change the game. It establishes a data-driven investment strategy through co-funding from the State Disaster Mitigation Fund to incentivize higher-risk, high-impact projects. So by offering this government matching, it fundamentally changes the corporate incentive structure. It neutralizes the implementation risks, completely overrides those corporate proximity biases, and directs those billions exactly where the disaster risk data says vulnerable people need it most.
As we look at India's future, aligning these mandated corporate billions with actual empirical risk data isn't just some clever accounting trick. It is a fundamental paradigm shift. So the question we're left with is this: will we continue to just manage disasters after they ruin lives, or will we finally use our data to invest proactively, steer towards risk-informed sustainable development, and build unbreakable national resilience? It is a multi-billion-dollar question, and the answer is going to shape the future for millions.